Hello, my name's Leslie Smith and I work in the academic office dealing with academic quality assurance. In this section I'd like to talk to you for a few moments about paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is an alternative way to include the ideas of others in your work without using quotation marks and citations. Paraphrasing is putting things into your own words when you've come across something that you would like to include in your assignment or discussion, and it's a really good technique to use when you're doing your background reading and making notes from what you're reading, because it avoids you having to write things down directly from the source and then maybe forgetting the reference or how to cite it properly. In short, it's a way to cover some of the good ideas and concepts that you come across in your broader reading around your subject without running the risk of either overquoting or misquoting. So, paraphrasing is about taking an idea and rephrasing it using your own words. Just think of it as explaining what you have read to somebody who hasn't had the opportunity to do the reading themselves and doesn't know the concepts. Paraphrasing is about condensing down ideas as well, so you'll often find that a paraphrase is much shorter than the original, and therefore, when you're having to think about word counts, it can save you some. One thing that you must remember with paraphrasing is you're not using your own ideas, just your own words. The idea belongs to somebody else, and therefore you will still need to reference where you found the idea. But what you don't need is quotation marks because you're not quoting something directly from the source. So why would you need to paraphrase then in the first place? Well, you may have come across a really excellent idea in some reading that you've been doing, or an article, a book, or even something that you've heard on the news or seen on the TV, and you want to include it in an assignment or module discussion. But you may remember seeing on the academic declaration at the start of your module that we have strict rules regarding the amount of direct quotations we expect to find in your work. So you will from time to time need to find other ways to include relevant information or ideas without overquoting. Another reason you might want to paraphrase is because you've got a really good argument or good development of an idea in your work, and you want to find some support for that in the literature that's out there, or in some of the theories which could support your claims in your work. That would be an excellent time to paraphrase an authoritative source that you've come across. Normally, when you're writing something for assessment, you have a word limit. You can't write endlessly, but you also don't want to leave out some major thinkers on the topic that you're covering. You don't want to put in quotes from each of those thinkers, so what you can do is you can bundle them all together and you can paraphrase what they say about the subject that you're writing about. Of course, one of the things that you'll find if you do use the skill of paraphrasing is that the mental process you go through will enable you to learn a lot easier, because you're having to think about what the expert has said and you're having to answer the question, so what does that mean? How would I express that in my own way? That process on its own is a part of learning, and you'll find that you'll understand and get a much better grasp of concepts if you try paraphrasing. Of course, one of the things you need to consider when you're writing anything for assessment is that we have rules about using too many quotes. I've mentioned this before. You'll find that your grade could be significantly reduced if your instructor feels that you've put too many quotations in your piece of work. You'll see those rules written on the module declaration that you have to sign. They're also on the Centre for Student Success. We like to know what you think about a particular topic. We like to know what your ideas are, but if you just quote other people all the time, we're not getting a sense of what you understand of a particular concept. So therefore, if you paraphrase, you avoid the temptation just to put lots of quotations into your work, yet you can still manage to cover the breadth of ideas that are out there in the literature. Now, paraphrasing is a real skill, just like anything else. It's one that you will have to learn and practice. It's not something that everybody can do straight away. But there are some little hints and tips that I can tell you about so that you can start on your own paraphrasing and just see how you get on. So, you've read something that's a really great idea, you think that's fabulous, I want to put that into my work. But then when you sit down and start to think, well, How do I write that differently? It's been so well expressed in the original source. Well, it's sometimes very difficult to know how to express it in your own words. So the first thing you should do, if you come across something that you want to use, is to decide if you're going to quote or paraphrase it, of course. If you're going to quote it, that's just fine. Just put the original words down and make sure that you make a good note of the source so that you can reference it correctly. It's when you're reading the original source that you need to start thinking, so how would I put this in my own words? And the notes that you write at that point should be in your own words. Resist the urge to copy what you're reading if you don't intend quoting it and you want to paraphrase. Because otherwise, when you come back to your notes and start to think, the temptation will be really hard to quote it, first of all, and secondly, because the original words are there and you haven't gone through this mental process of trying to think how you would say that same thing, it's going to be that much harder. Now, you might want to read through the full article or chapter of the book first before you start to make notes for yourself. That will give you a really good understanding not just of the main ideas, but how the author is developing those ideas as he or she goes through. So don't think that you have to start making notes as soon as you start reading. I always find that the best thing to do is to read it through once for sense and then go back and read it through again and then start making notes. That way my brain has a chance to really synthesize what I'm reading and to come to some conclusions about what the main ideas are. What you mustn't forget, even when you're writing things in your own words though, is that eventually you're going to have to reference this paraphrase. You've got to acknowledge whose idea it was. So just with any other article that you might be quoting elsewhere in your work, you need to make a note of the full information for the reference. And that will depend on the referencing style that's in use on your particular degree programme. But it's likely to include things like page numbers for any book that you're reading. It will include a volume number for any article that you've been reading. So make sure you clearly make a note next to your paraphrase of where this idea has come from, and that will help you later. Then you have to think, what's the main point, or maybe the two main ideas that this particular source is telling me. Make a note of them in your own words. Just bullet points will do. You don't need to write full sentences, just something that's going to remind you of what you've read. Then the next stage is to put the notes to one side and try not to use them straight away. It's sometimes a good idea to go back to things after a short break because you get a different perspective on them, or you'll get a better understanding after you've allowed the ideas to percolate through your brain for a little while. So at this stage you should be ready to start thinking about writing out the ideas that you want to include in your work. And at this point you need to feel as if you're talking or writing to somebody that you know well, but who doesn't understand what you're trying to explain to them. There's no point in trying to shorten things down just for the sake of it. Make sure that you clearly express the ideas that you've come across. And put your ideas into full sentences. I'd like at this point just to introduce a word of warning about paraphrasing. It's very tempting when you're trying to put things into your own words to use some of the tools that we find on the computer these days that help us to find alternative words. Now, if you just use synonyms or antonyms or other thesaurus type references, that's not going to produce a good paraphrase. If you've taken an original piece of work from an article or a book word for word and you try using a synonym tool or something of that nature, just to change one word or two here and there, or even if you think of your own words but you keep the same sentence structure and the same development of the argument through your paraphrase as the original source, then you may find that it still becomes so similar to the original that you'll be accused of plagiarising. Now, when you just change an odd word or two here and there, it's known as patchworking. It's very easy to detect. All of our instructors are very experienced, and it's easy to spot when somebody does this. It will lead you into some unnecessary trouble, so try to avoid doing this. So you have to be really clear when you're paraphrasing that you don't cut and paste the original, don't include it in the notes when you're going through the article, and that way you should find that whatever you're saying about the particular idea will be coming just from your brain and from your own thoughts. Well, I wanted to give you an example of how to paraphrase and how not to paraphrase so that you would get some practical idea of how this works. Now, as we're the University of Liverpool, it would be wrong of me if I didn't use the work of someone well known who comes from Liverpool in this example. So I'm going to use the words from a song that John Lennon wrote in the 1970s called Imagine. A lot of people know this song, but if you don't know it, here are some of the original lyrics on the screen now. So let's imagine that we want to write about the song that John Lennon recorded in the 70s, but we don't want to cite and quote it directly word for word. We're just writing about it, so we want to get across some of the ideas that Lennon was writing about in the song. If you look at this next example that's coming onto the screen now, you will see how somebody has tried to paraphrase what John Lennon wrote, but they haven't done it necessarily in their own words. What you're reading is very similar to the original, and this is what we would call patchworking. The next example that you can see on the screen is also an example of a bad paraphrase. It's very similar to the first one, but you will notice that a couple of the words have been changed. So instead of using the words heaven and hell, for example, we've looked them up on a synonym tool and replaced them with our own words. But it's still not conveying in our own words the thoughts in the lyrics. However, if you want to look at this final example, this is an example of an acceptable paraphrase. You will see that the original ideas of the song are still there, the flow is still there, but it's completely our own words. So just to summarise what we've been talking about over the last few minutes, a paraphrase should be in your own words. You should give the meaning of the original source without quoting from the source, and it's about what you believe the author has said. And lastly, don't forget that just as if you were quoting from another source, you will still need to include correct referencing for your paraphrase. What you're seeing now on the screen are the 3 key points about paraphrasing, about putting it into your own words, about referencing, and avoiding the temptation to just lift a passage from a source and use a synonym tool to patchwork. Remember, we want you to show that you've understood and can apply what you've learnt. You're not going to do this just by quoting all the time, but you will show your understanding that you've really learnt your subject by paraphrasing from time to time.